If you didn't have more hospitality, maybe.
Cool. Prime Minister, when you're ready, you're here.
Wait, do I have to speak into the mic? Can I just... Okay.
Wait, where's the camera? Was I something?
The camera is that red flag over there.
Oh gosh, okay.
Oh.
Oh no, just look this way the whole time. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So first of all, I'm just going to clarify what we mean by the idea of like the ends justifying the means. I think when we're talking about this, what we're talking about is this is equivalent to whether like net positive outcomes are worth the steps you take in all situations, even if there's some harm in these, whether that's worth it. That's what we're talking about. On the comparative, if the ends don't justify the means, this means there are fundamental values we have to protect regardless of if they result in net positive outcomes. I'm bringing you 2 main cases in my speech today. First of all, I'm going to bring you the idea that there are like the idea that in society, like some accepted principles, don't have like positive outcomes in all situations. And secondly, I'm going to bring you the idea that even though we have harmful means, this could result in like these values that I'm talking about, these fundamental values, being protected in the long term. So firstly, onto my first point. So in society, there are accepted principles that we think are wrong. Let's take the example of lying. People realize that lying is wrong. This is a means, we shouldn't immediately resort to. But the problem is that in many situations, let's take the example that many people know. If there's a madman at your door with an axe, and it asks you where like your children are in the house, are they upstairs? Lying to them, if you stick to the fundamental principle that lying is wrong and you tell them they're upstairs, then the problem with this is that your outcome is going to be very harmful to your child in this situation. So therefore, we believe in situations like this, even though this is like an extreme example, it shows you how in situations that like if the ends is better, it justifies the means, even if that means is doing something which is seen as harmful, such as lying. It's beneficial because of the outcome you get of saving your child in this situation. I think the thing that, just to put it simply, when we say that the ends justifies the means, we maximize like goodness and like the good outcomes on our side. Sure. Okay. Yeah, on our side we get this. I think on the comparative, what you get is when you say that the ends do not justify like the means. The problem with this is that you can always justify like why something like cannot be done because you see the means as harmful. This is not like a fundamental like thing, but you can justify why, even though something has a positive outcome, why you won't want to do it. And this is really harmful because you get less good outcomes when you do that. Let's take the example of like taking taxes from people. People don't want taxes taken from them. People like even who are on like low income. This is like somewhat a harmful means, but I think the most important thing is we need this to get the ends of having a welfare system which is maintained, which is very, very important. Moving on to my second point, I think that this is very vital because I think it is a necessity to do means, even if they have some harm associated with them, because sometimes they're needed to protect fundamental values. Let's take the example of like in society, let's take the example of like a fundamental value, like freedom, for example, when people value this. I think if society fully prioritizes like freedom in this way to do whatever you want, yeah, sure.
If freedom is something you prioritize and you believe is the most important thing, surely you must never you don't have freedom, and that is the way you reach this outcome.
Okay, so when we're talking about freedom in this way, it's let's say freedom is the most important thing that we're valuing. Let's say we prioritize freedom to such an extent we say we're never going to imprison people, whatever. This results in a society where people are no longer able to go outside because of this lack of safety. Because even though you have the freedom to, do whatever you want, the problem is later down the line you result in this like harm of there being no freedom for you. this is very damaging, because then if you're in like a system of government, the problem is the government's going to have to overcorrect for this in the future, because if they originally, have the fundamental value of freedom, if they if the ends justify the means, as in protecting, like, even not fully, like, if this fundamental value isn't like the means aren't like fully protected in all situations, this means we prevent later down the line this harm of having less freedom. So if the freedom is the most important thing, we get this better on our side. And I think this is fundamental, because there are many important things. Like, for example, for a society to function, you need like a strong legal system to be able to like enforce people's rights. You need police to have safety. And I think this is very, very important, because if you say that in all situations, like, you should fundamentally protect like the fundamental values, this is like very harmful, because it means you're not prioritizing these things. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but the motion is not, should you balance things? You have to stand behind immoral actions being committed for a greater good. So in many instances, it's like discrimination against minorities for a greater good.
Okay, so first of all, I think that's an example which we can't we can't really use, because what is the greater good in that situation? I think what we're doing is, when we say we're talking about like harmful means, we have to talk about something which has a net positive outcome. That's what we bring you on our side. There is going to be this net positive outcome, and in your example there, you really just don't get that. But in examples like the ones I've talked about, where, the means are things that as society, even though, like, objectively lying is not wrong, it's something we agree on as a society, that something like lying is wrong. Something like freedom is very important to people. This is something we can, like, largely accept is very, very important. So when I'm talking about the means, this means that, like, we're not fundamentally protecting these principles, because, as I've told you, it could result in a worse outcome later down the line. I think something important I also want to talk about is the idea that when we're saying that the ends justify the means, I think this is very important, because this leads us to a society where we measure things on the outcomes they have rather than the methods to get there. And this is very clear for them people to be able to see, like, whether things are like good in society, because the means can be like construed, but it's a lot easier to have a metric on measuring things on the outcome they have. This is a lot easier for the average person to see. So I think this is a big benefit we get on our side of when people can see like a positive outcomes in things. So let's take the example of government. If, for example, like the government does something and it's positive like outcomes, we can look at this specifically and say like that the ends are positive, and therefore we can justify the means to get there. And for that reason, I'm proud to propose.
I think Prime Minister and Club, what are your propositions?
A brief trigger warning for this debate. This debate will include mentions of a handful of upsetting things, these including sexual assault, rape, and torture. I will try to keep the first two as non-graphic as humanly possible. I will flag when each of these are coming up, but just so that everyone in this room is aware, I will give 5 seconds just also to let people make their mind up about leaving. Cool, all seems to be fine. If that's okay with everyone, I will begin my case in 3, 2, 1. The case coming out of opposition is very simple. It is firstly that consequentialism is not tenable as an ideology. It is simply not true. They tell you that they will stand behind any situation, and this is the burden they impose themselves, where if you do the calculus, the net positive, the utility, so to speak, outweighs how you got there. Our second case is that consequentialism is actually actively bad. Firstly, to address the first case, and explain to you why they cannot stand behind the idea that if you get a utility out of something, something is good. This is where the mentions of rape and assault will come in. There are some actions that we think are so heinous that they will never be justified. They give you the example of lying. This is not an action that we think can never be justified. When we look into the ways that utilitarianism is criticised, one of the main criticisms of it is swine ethics. And I think, panel, this is the example that I put forward to you. Someone is asleep on the floor. They have been drugged. They are very, very deeply asleep, and they will not wake up. Moreover, this person will not suffer any physical harm if you rape them. Panel, you ultimately get sexual satisfaction. This is utility. The question is, do you rape them? Under a utilitarian metric, you must, because you are getting a net positive. This person will never know this. No one else in the world will ever know this. It is just you and this person alone in a room. They've passed out in a back alley, etc., etc. No one else will ever know this. you will get sexual satisfaction from this. Unless you can stand up and say that the goodness, the utility, the happiness that you, the assaulter, get, because the other person does not know. There is no innate harm incurred to them. Panel, if you believe there is a harm, it is because you believe the action is, in and of itself, fundamentally wrong, because you've instrumentalised that person towards your own ends. And unless Gov teams are willing to stand behind that panel, their claim is not true, their analysis is not tenable, and they must fall out. Taken?
Yeah, so deontology is also an ends justify the means system. It's that you treat every person as an end in and of themselves. So this debate is not about consequentialism versus deontology, because they're both ends focused, right?
I don't think we necessarily have to stand behind deontology in all circumstances. I think it is sufficient for us to prove there are some actions in which the ends will never justify the means. If the motion read the ends might justify the means, we might have to take different burdens. I think you have to stand behind all of these circumstances, and I don't think this is the case. Panel, at the point where I think I've made it patently clear that this is not the case, the ends do not always justify the means, I think it is true that anything Gov stands behind is simply false. Now on then, to why I think consequentialism and the notion that you can instrumentalise people as a mean is actively harmful in all cases. There'll be no further discussions of assault, but there may be mentions of torture. Huzzah, consequentialism is likely bad. Why is this always going to be the case? We get told that in a society, it's probably not the case that anyone does suffer. This is the question that Nikhil asks. It's about things like fundamental freedom. How do we protect that? The thing is that any justification in society is likely not something that you are doing as a single individual. It's partaking on a social level as well as an individual level. And the vast majority of circumstances, this is top-down. This is why his name begins with a K, but I actually can't remember. The psychologist suggested essentially when you are trying to reach moral reasoning, you go up in tiers, and the very final and the hardest tier to reach is individualised moral reasoning. The vast majority of the time, it is being delivered to you by moral institutions, by the church, by your legal system, by your political state, by medical institutions, so on and so forth. They tell you, they tell you that various things are moral acts to do. The legal system is the clearest example. They tell you this is a wrong thing to do, and we will punish you. This was a right thing to do, and we will not. When you view people as a end, as a means, you ultimately are not willing to give these people their fundamental human dignity. And this is the most harmful thing that you should value in this debate. This is the principle of actual dignity for all individual people that you must value, and you cannot have that if you are instrumentalizing them. When this weight comes from above, it is likely the case that it reflects various hierarchical powers that are already in existence. When you are taking the moral weighing of people who are already in power, who are interested in concentrating their own power further, it is likely that they are actually instrumentalizing and harming very specific groups of people. This is the minority groups that Nikhil points out to you. E.g., if you are the British government in the 1920s, and you're not interested in the lives of people of colour, because frequently you view them as a means to an end, the end being the growth of the British Empire, which, particularly if you go back another 100 years, you literally believe that God has put you on earth to do, and that it is the greatest good of all goods, you continue to do that. You believe you have achieved your good in spite of the fact that your hands are drenched in blood. This is the example that Ursula Le Guin gives you in The Ones That Walk Away from Amalia. She imagines you to imagine a world that is absolutely perfect in every regard. You know bliss beyond any compare. There is no troubles in your life, no worries. You've never woken up anxious, hungry, or sad. Every day of your life is the best day of your life. On the day that you turn 18, however, panel, someone sits you down and they say, I have to tell you something about our perfect town and our perfect life. They take your hand and they lead you into a dark cellar. In the middle of the cellar, where there are no windows, no light, is a small child. He cannot be older than 10. He has been tortured beyond imagination every single day of his life. He suffers endlessly, and he will do until the end of time. And you are told that your happiness rests on the suffering of this young boy. The question that she asks you is, do you continue to actually live in that world as a perfect life? And I think the second you know this, panel, the second you know that your happiness, the net good of society, is based on the immense suffering of a single individual, you know that you, firstly, are not the dignified person that you thought you were, because your hands are soaked in the blood of other people. But that secondly, there is no justifying the immense suffering that this person endures. This is a profound harm. And they tell you that they can stand behind fundamental freedoms so this doesn't happen. But this is a utilitarian way of weighing things. The ends here are vastly disproportionate to that immense suffering of that one child, because it's so many people who live such unimaginably perfect lives. But it is clear, panel, to the average person that it is not right that this child suffers. It is not right that you leave him there to do that. And moreover, it is not right when you and every other person around you becomes an instrument in moral calculus that is bigger than yourself. Because in any world where other people do not value you as an individual moral agent with full individual autonomy, but instead part of a calculus, you lose out on fundamental human dignity. And this is what all principles are based on. If we value freedom because you are a dignified human being. But at the point where powers above you actively instrumentalize you for things that are bigger than yourself, things that are always likely to harm minority groups the most, because these are the groups that will suffer for the greater good, it is very easy to placate the vast majority, for instance, of men if you lock women out of the workplace, because these are the people that do benefit. And in this way, when you harm this one specific group of people, everyone else benefits. This is a story my grandmother tells me routinely. She says, it was great in the 1970s, actually, because if you were a man, you walked home to a warm dinner, and if you were a child, there was always someone in the house to look after you. It was fucking terrible if you were a woman that had dreams. And the thing is that en masse, this is good for society to do things this way. You get children who have actively a supportive parent in the house at all times. You get someone to go home to who is supposed to cook you meals and to care for you. And you ultimately are likely to have proper wages because the workplace has not been feminized and we're not splitting dual income and all the burden of housework also. But panel, this is wrong, because we've instrumentalized people, we've used people as a means to the happiness of others, and we've undermined the dignity and the autonomy of these individual women. And when we actively say that you're part of a moral calculus and not a person in and of yourselves that deserve to be treated as a person, as the end in and of yourself, because that is what all our lives are. They are an end. We are the full stop. We are everything that we can ever become. And when you take people down and you distill them into something that is a moral calculus, you lose out on that value. Very simply put, the case memo is as follows. You would not rape the woman lying on the floor because it is wrong to do so, regardless of any joy you derive. You would not rape her and then call other people to come and do the same, in spite of the fact that you could multiply this happiness endlessly with you and all of your friends. Because there are some things, fundamentally, the instrumentalization of people, that are just wrong, and they are always wrong. That's the case.
Thank you, your opposition, the call for Deputy Prime Minister.
I don't have a photo of the motion. It is this House believes the ends justify the means, right? Okay.
Also, I appreciate you don't want to be recorded, but is it okay if the recording stays on?
Yeah, that's fine. As long as it's not like, because I just have a feeling it's going to be bad, so I just. Okay. My speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. So first of all, I'd like to clarify some things about our case, and I think that there's like a conflation with like, I think so far, I know it's only been one speech, but so far what has come out of OO is like, kind of like general criticisms of like utilitarianism, things like that, but just note that this isn't specifically on quantity. Things like consequentialism can take into account other values when making their calculations, right? Like there's different types of like utility, right? Like the rape example would only be viewed as a positive output if you think that, if you go with hedonistic utilitarianism, right? Like simply, I think the cases that they draw out on rely on this idea that our calculation is just like what benefits the most people, and there's no like principle to it. Like in philosophy, I don't think there is a single utilitarian consequentialist view that doesn't rely on some principle that we believe we should achieve, right? There can be vulnerability calculations. There's preference utilitarianism, act versus rule utilitarianism. My point is that every form of utilitarianism, consequentialism, relies on certain outcomes, like which outcomes we value. So when you say things like, oh, but rape will give that person pleasure, we don't believe that this is something that we're justifying on our side of the house, because that would only be a good outcome if we say that pleasure is what's important. I think that what we are then supposed to focus on is this idea that doing things as what's like conventionally considered the right way in order to access a certain benefit, access an outcome that we can agree morally is like a good thing. So I'm just gonna give you some like banal examples, right? Like, on an individual level, this looks like someone stealing bread in order to feed their family. The means that they went through, the bread they stole, right? Maybe they even took 50 cents away from a shopkeeper, right? But if that is, I'm gonna talk about necessity and accessibility. If that is the only way that you can achieve this outcome, and sometimes immoral means are not the right way to do things is the only way you can achieve an outcome. I don't see why. I think it's just intuitively I think if you intuition check, I think that we're willing to make this trade-off, right? Yes, I'll take your POI now.
If you're not standing behind utilitarianism, actually what is the metric on which you're weighing a good quote-unquote outcome?
Okay, I literally just said, sorry, that was rude. What I'm saying is that utilitarianism is what we're using, but it's not like hedonistic utilitarianism where we're saying pleasure. It's utilitarianism that is trying to promote certain good values, right? So I'm just gonna take I just wanna note that ends, if you say that ends don't justify the means, then there's literally no way to resolve the fact that sometimes there are conflicting duties, conflicting goods. So Sartre, in the Nazi occupation of France, he uses this as an example, right? You have, we say that it is a good thing to obey the law. Obeying the law is bad. It is also a good thing to protect a Jew in your basement, right? These are both considered good things. If the ends don't justify the means, we have no way to resolve conflicting duties. And I think that this is one incredibly harmful thing. Whereas if we have a consequence that we want, right? Also, I'm not going to take any more POIs, I took one. If you have a consequence that you think is good, if there is a consequence that we can agree is morally good, I'm not going to get into like subjectivism, like, oh, but the government might say that like colonialism is good because it brings economic output. Because again, consequentialism, utilitarianism can have certain values that you are trying to protect. And the thing is, you're saying on the net, do we get this? Like vulnerability of minorities can be a value that you're trying to maximize. So I don't think that we should get into specific examples, right? So this brings me on to like our secondary case, right? Doing things the right way is only accessible to certain people in a lot of cases. Those with power. Using a bad means might be the only way for people without power to flourish, to fight back. This looks like the MKK in South Africa who used violent means in order to take down apartheid. We can agree as a society generally that like killing is wrong, but insofar as the consequentialist output means that for the rest of time, ideally, you no longer have a system which is actively oppressing people. Killing, even though we agree as a society that killing is wrong, the means killing is wrong, it was the only way for people who were powerless in order to access justice, right? Why is the bad way sometimes the only way to access things? I think this has to do with like existing power structures, because it's all well and good to focus the debate on like an ideal world, but the reality is we apply morality to the world that we have. If there are existing power structures, that means that people are not able to go about things the right way in order to actually achieve benefits, in order to actually reach these things that we count as good, like that we want to maximize, like freedom, protection of vulnerability, etc., etc. People who are vulnerable have to rely on those in power who can access certain mechanisms, who can like, let's just say like are already in politics and can like go to government and they can get a majority and they can, or they're a leader of another country, like they can work within power systems in order to like achieve this good outcome. What this means is that you are then, if the means don't justify the ends, this means that people who do not have power essentially don't have autonomy. They have no way to resolve their issue. They're reliant on the goodwill of other people. And we don't think that this is a moral framework that we can stand by. Because if you're going to say that we have to justify rape, then you have to justify like letting apartheid stay forever because international pressure did nothing. It was the MKK that put pressure. It was these violent means that under your side are a bad means because you are principally saying killing is wrong. Like if we want to play with examples, then let's say that. So then, what are we really saying? What did India say? Because I want to like reiterate this, right? She's essentially telling you that this is also, in terms of weighing, this is better in the long term, because insofar as you get things like, for example, a bad thing to do would be to limit someone's freedom, but like intuitively we're willing to make the trade-off that you can limit someone's freedom by putting them in prison if they go around killing people, right? This is a bad means because limiting someone's freedom is wrong, but if it gives you long-term safety, long-term weighing, this is better in the long term because it actually like focuses on like maximizing these ideals that we believe to be true, right? Also, seeing someone as an ends does not give them dignity is something else that comes out of OO. I don't think that this is necessarily true, right? Like, yeah, like, I think you always, like, you can view people as having dignity in a consequentialist view, because given that your consequentialist view is still maximizing a certain principle that helps people, that means that you are viewing people as having dignity, are viewing people as being worthy. I think the only case where this isn't true is in hedonistic utilitarianism, which honestly, I think if you brought this up in this debate, you'd have to be like really like hate yourself, because it's so hard to defend. Thank you.
Okay. In Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle wrote, every activity aims at some good. Hence, it is well said that the good is that at which all activities aim. This is not an ethics debate. This is, in fact, a meta-ethics debate. And I think there are three interpretations of this phrase. And on every single interpretation, it collapses, as in it becomes trivially true. And I think that's just going to win the debate. So, first definition. We may interpret, and I'm just going to, instead of saying means, I'm going to say acts. And I think that'll be an uncontroversial substitution, because I think we're not particularly concerned with whether or not a certain planet falls out of orbit in some distant galaxy. We're concerned with the moral status of certain actions or the reasonability of certain actions. So the first way you might interpret this phrase is that the reason why an act is taken is some end, using the term justify in terms of orient. So the reason why you might choose to pick up an axe instead of a hammer is that you're trying to chop down a tree. So in this sense, the end dictates the means. This becomes trivially true in the case of agents, because every single act we take is dictated by some desire we have, some distant psychological reason. There always becomes an explanation of this. So that is on its face trivially true. The second way we can interpret this phrase is sort of more in line with the way the rest of this debate has gone, which is that the moral character, good or bad, of an act is determined by its end. And what we mean by this is that the state of affairs that it achieves. Now, don't confuse this interpretation with the good or bad of an act is determined by its outcome, because an innocent act may, by mistake, cause a bad outcome. That's irrelevant to this motion. But what we should note here with this definition is that an act has no moral character per se. Where an act becomes something that is morally evaluable is when a state of affairs results, which is that I have done something and therefore caused something to happen in the world, as in purely internal acts don't have a moral character. Sort of unintentional acts don't have a moral character. What matters is that something, in fact, has happened. So an end is a state of affairs. And on any given moral framework, the given state of affairs that you have defined as good or bad is going to determine what the appropriate means are. So let's say you have a desire for a state of affairs not to obtain. On OO's logic, you have a desire not to have a state of affairs obtain that someone is assaulted or that someone's dignity is defiled. The desire to obtain this end justifies the act of not defiling this individual or not assaulting them. Therefore, on their own moral logic, what they have defined as an end, the dignity of a human being, the state of affairs of them not being defiled, still justify the means. In fact, they're the way through which we determine what means to take. If it is a choice between doing this defilation and not doing it, it is the means that the end that they have chosen as morally valuable that actually dictates which of those choices that we take. So whether or not you are a utilitarian or whether or not you are a deontologist, it is what you define as a good state of affairs, the end in and of itself, that will always dictate what the means are. Because it doesn't matter which one you choose. It is going to be determinative of what the means are to achieving it. So this is the ultimate collapse of this into triviality. As in, take as a placeholder for end, just define end as a placeholder term for good, and it becomes the case that every single thing becomes an end that justifies the means. So their perspective on it is that there are immoral actions being taken for a greater good. But this, again, reduces to absurdity, because an immoral action is just one that results in a bad state of affairs. So whether or not something is an immoral action being taken for a greater good is a question of whether or not the end it achieves is something that we ought to value. Therefore, once again, defining something as an immoral action relies on you saying the end that it achieves makes it an unjustifiable means to choose given the situation. That's only 4 minutes of the speech, but I don't really see a flaw in the logic so far. So I'm going to move on to the third element of the speech, which is that I suppose we can engage with the rest of the debate about utilitarianism and deontology insofar as, it is not in the meaning of the ends justify the means that utilitarianism is the best moral theory, but it's certainly connoted by it. So it's important, I think, that we win this clash as well. So the important thing is that any other form of moral framework will require us to define who is owed what besides utilitarianism. The issue is that things like duties or things like what constitutes a virtuous individual are perspectival and psychological in deeply entrenched ways. So to whom you feel you owe a duty is impacted by the stories that you have read about who is valuable in society. It is impacted by your proximity to certain other individuals and your psychological relationships with them, which infiltrate your moral beliefs and make you value them more than other people in the world. It is dictated by social factors, the exact social factors that Nikhil talks about, as in who is considered an evil member of society. Throughout history, associations of blackness with evilness, all this kind of stuff, mean that the social worth dictates the moral worth of individuals, which means that largely speaking, on their side of the house, people will, if they choose this framework, apply it wrong and have a fallacious basis for it. Rather, the better way to approach morality is that we owe an equal obligation to all people,
as in this is the only way in which we can sidestep the concern of whether or not we are defining who is owed what in the right way by collapsing it to we owe an equal obligation to maximize the benefit of all individuals. The next thing I want to note about utilitarianism is that the pushbacks that we get to it from opening opposition are not particularly decisive. So they ask us a few questions, or they ask us about dignity, saying, like, why don't we, they say, dignity is the ultimate thing that we ought to value in human life. But it's still unclear to me what dignity actually is, as in we've gotten no definition of it. And it's not clear to me that dignity does not also collapse to pleasure and pain. So I feel bad when I am disrespected. Is that not the basis of dignity being valuable? Sure.
Immoral actions are not dependent on outcomes. The harmless thing is still a bad action, regardless of whether the outcome is felt or not.
No, but by your own definition, the assault is not harmless because it results in a state of affairs in which an individual has been assaulted. That's why it's bad. There's no such thing, like by your own metric, there is no such thing as a harmless assault. That's why you don't. That's why you say it's a bad thing to do, right? Like the only way in which there could be a harmless state of affairs is in which there are no two human beings involved, or like there is no moral worth assigned to any of the individuals involved, which means that that's outside the remit of this debate. So dignity collapses to pain and pleasure again. And the second thing I want to know is all the thought experiments that are brought up, right? Because there are a lot of thought experiments that make utilitarianism sound very silly, but I'm not sure what the value of a thought experiment is, as in we're probing the intuitions that we have, which, as I just mentioned earlier, tend to be perspectival and psychological and socially defined. So I'm not sure why we ought to value our intuitions. So invert the child torture thought experiment. Would you kill all human beings so the child may be happy? The inverse of it also leads to an absurdity, so I'm not sure why we should care about the inverse or the correct way. So, but most of the issues with these thought experiments are problems of additivity. And sure, maybe it may not be the case that a small amount of pleasure for a huge group can be added up over time, but you don't need that for utilitarianism. We can just say that utility, on their side of the house, is much easier to define in absence of power structures as compared to everything else, and therefore utilitarianism ends up being the most reasonable thing to... I don't know.
One simple principle from us. The ends are subjective, they're hard to predict, and when we are unsure on these ends, we ought not defer to it. We think that the ends are subjective and it's far more subjective than the means, mainly because there are universal agreed upon moral frameworks, i.e. the means that are generally taught across different age groups, different countries, globally. We think, i.e. it's generally agreed upon that rape is really quite bad because it takes away someone's agency because they're scared. They're afraid to go out and live life for fear that they might be raped again, for fear that they might experience bad things again. This lack of agency is generally quite bad. However, what is not agreed upon is what is the best way to alleviate this restricted agency? What is the best way to get this victim catharsis? This is something that is not agreed upon universally whatsoever. I.e., some people might heal better alone. They might need alone time to restructure themselves away from other people. Some people might need to be surrounded by people, to have people reassure them, have people validate their feelings. Some people might need justice. They might need to avenge themselves and physically or legally get justice from their perpetrator. This is all very subjective. There is no best way to determine this. So both are debated. But because it's easier to teach good and bad actions, because they are our own actions and we know the consequences of our own actions, means are far less subjective. I.e., I know that if I stop talking right now, I probably won't get credited for anything, and I'm leaving a huge burden on Ziyad, and I know that this is a really bad thing because I know the actions of my own I know the consequences of my own actions. We think that ends are comparatively far harder to predict. Firstly, other people are uncontrollable factors out of our control. It's hard to predict the way in which different people will react and or the different ways people will develop as they grow older and change people, even if they change at all. Because we don't have epistemic access to people, i.e. we don't understand what's going on through people's brains, we don't understand what they're thinking, what they are feeling, we don't understand like how they internalize different things, how they feel about different moral philosophies. We are unsure in the ways that they will react, and think because people have had different life experiences, i.e. people might have been raised in different religious backgrounds, in different cultural backgrounds, they might have been born different genders, they might have been part of like a queer community, they might be part of different communities in which have these communities and these differences have impacted the way in which that they have experienced the world, and so the way in which they're likely to react to the world. These are uncontrollable. We don't know how they're going to do this because we cannot read their minds. So we are unsure of this. I'll take it from opening. Yeah.
Okay, why are only outcomes things that are subjectivist? Surely the fact that different religions, different countries, whatever, have different things that they consider moral and immoral means that like your case doesn't stand, because in that sense, then even in the actual act itself can be considered immoral by one person and moral by the other.
So I just talked about why when you get to choose your own actions, you probably are likely to know the consequences of your own actions because you've probably done those actions before. I'm going to talk about this later in like Mech 3, I think. I'll expand more on that and I'll try remember to flag it. Secondly, because other people have different life experiences and they react in different ways and they are very different human beings, they are either benefited or harmed to a far greater or smaller extent than you can predict at all. I.e., when you're talking about childhood with like two friends. One friend might have had a great childhood and that might bring them a lot of joy, a lot of net joy for them to talk about their childhood, and they get to relive their childhood experiences and share their joyful memories. While the other friend might have had a traumatic childhood, and this talking about your childhood, hearing other people talk about their happiness of their childhood may make them feel significantly worse about their childhood trauma. Maybe they were abused by a parent. They can feel not only upset by this, they can actually be triggered by this and spiral deeper. We are unsure on the reactions and the feelings that other people will experience because of that. We also think, thirdly, this is the Mech, we think that means happens far more than all ends, i.e. That often moral choices happen on the daily. I could have decided to leave Ziyad to Iron Man this thing alone, which probably would have been harder for him. And this is probably a bad thing. Different moral choices happen literally daily, whether you can choose to help the homeless person when you're walking by the street or not. These things happen before our eyes every single day at almost every single second. But these all have like different ends because there's different situations, i.e. because there's different people, there's different times, there's different places. Even the same people at different times on the same day may react far differently because they have experienced something that has changed their mood. And so something you say to someone on the same day might negatively or positively impact their mood. Literally just mathematically, you have a limited number of choices, but the ends, given all the different situations and all the different variables, are very unpredictable. Fourthly, we think time. Decisions happen in very short time frames. Life must move on. You cannot spend 10 minutes deciding every single action ever. You do not have enough time to consider and to try and actually come to a somewhat justifiable thing of ends. We don't have time to analyze all the possible ends given the other variables, and so we're likely to make a rush decision and not know this. But also fifthly, we think that the universe is random. There are external factors out of our control, i.e. we cannot control natural events. I cannot control if an earthquake happens right here or not. I cannot control if a car crash will block my journey from me going into college or not. It's out of our control. It is unpredictable. We do not think that ends are sure. But we think morality should be constant. Given the uncertainty, the morals, and the fact that our morals are tested daily on a very fast basis, we think that when you cannot internalize this moral framework because you're unsure on the ends, that we ought not or we ought reject this statement because it's something that leaves us with uncertainty in our life, that we're always unsure, we're always left thinking, what if I could have done this better? What if I could have actually helped someone? We think that this uncertainty can often haunt people, but we also think that when you're reliant on ends justifying the means, you can also be subconsciously selfish because we know our own experiences more than other people. We think on that, the means justified.
Rob gives us 3 ways this motion collapsed trivially, and I'll explain the 2 ones that engage the greatest in the debate. After that, I'll rebut. It's as simple as that. First of all, what does Rob tell us? His first explanation is just the act of not engaging in moral bad actions is an end which in itself justifies the means themselves, which means the entirety of OO's push, which is that some actions we find morally icky, in and of itself is like an end that we justify by not doing these morally harmful actions in and of itself. So the problem is in like every other team, it's very uncomparative and unsure on how individuals decide, determine, and what actually is an end versus what actually is a means. I think Rob is the only one that outlines this relatively clearly. And even if, panel, you don't buy this argumentation, Rob also tells you a very, very simple, very intuitive case, which directly clashes against closing opposition, which is that we ought prioritize utilitarianism regardless of all these other arguments, because it simply means like the minimization of suffering, right? Because the problem is, if closing opposition wants to say that everything is morally subjective and really unsure on things, I think we ought prioritize the most immediate and the most objective framework to stand on, which is the viscerality of pain, a biological construct that we all feel and is a universal feeling and is the most objective way in which we should weigh different metrics, i.e. you hence still should default to utilitarianism because of all these explanations they say. But secondarily, I'll first deal with closing opposition and then I'll talk about the top half comparisons. But my first question with CO is that maybe we don't know what a good end or what a bad end is. Like maybe it's confused, maybe a question. But whatever the good end is, clearly we ought to do the action that leads to it in and of itself, i.e. this is not what individuals should do themselves, but is what is morally justified and what in and of itself constitutes as a mean that is justified by the end and things like that. And hence, it doesn't matter if we don't know it is in actuality or actual tangible changes, but what matters is the concept is something that we ought to prioritize if it is possible. If we have all the information available and accessible, we ought to push towards that in and of itself, which means that even if it's subjective, all these things like that, we ought to prioritize this because there's an analogous right end in which that it should be justified in the first place. But secondarily, I also want to just push back on their actual mechanisms because I think it's a bit flippant and also a bit confusing. The first idea they explain is that means are comparatively more objective in terms of the moral harms in and of itself because we can't predict the ends. But I think the argument is relatively circular in terms of how they explain it, right? Because individuals are aware if their explanation or individuals are more aware if an action is morally good or an action is morally bad. But their awareness of this is precisely why the ends justify the means. They're aware of this action leads to a moral harm, or this action in and of itself is a moral harm, that it impedes on another individual's dignity, and hence they preemptively don't do that in the first place, i.e. the act of the reason that they explain why moral actions are more objective is because the ends justify the means in the first place. Before I talk about top half, OG.
You press pause at any point in time, that point in time is the end state. Under your first definition, where actually is the line between what is an act and what is the end goal? And if there is none, how can these things justify each other?
The problem here is, I think Rob relatively clearly characterizes and is conceded in the whole debate, an action is the mean, right? But the end is the consequence, or not only consequence, but end is a situation in which the action has happened, right? So the end could be a person's dignity being impeded, even though no one actually feels that actively. The end could be a situation in which maybe utilitarianistically, there is greater outcomes purely because we minimize the harm and the pain of more people in and of itself. But the problem is, every action ought to be justified morally or like logically because that there is a negative thing that happens after this individual action in and of itself. But then I want to directly interact with opening oppositions first. I think Rob relatively clearly explains why the thought experiments don't really work relatively well, but I want to directly interact with like what Nikhil says, right? Nikhil says we ought to prioritize agency because agency is the universality and the most important thing is debate. But I first want to just question why uniquely, in absence of the idea of the ends justifying the means, you get agency in and of itself. I have 4 questions that I don't think you end up getting answered because I don't think you get agency symmetrically, so there are other cases in and of itself it doesn't work. The first reason is just the existence of biological programming, right? Each of our individual actions are determined by things like hormones or the biological development or things like that, or just the fact that we want to procreate and stuff like that. That in and of itself doesn't prove to me that we as individuals have agency in the first place. Secondarily, there's just the idea of cultural and societal programming, right? Your mom teaching you specific frameworks that you ought to judge the world on, the education system teaching you different things that you ought to prioritize in and of itself. Because if all asserts that the concept of ends can be fully weaponized by the rich and wealthy elites in a way in which people become merely pawns in every single decision that make, I think that means that on either side of the house, you're unable to get any form of agency in and of itself, which means this clashes also out of the debate. But third of all, a large amount of people in the world believe in religion, right? They believe in religion in a way in which like, things are already predetermined in the first place. So Nikhil has a burden to prove that there's a significant amount of people that uniquely believe that they actually have agency and why it's unique to like, their side of the house. Because if their whole explanation is like, rich people determine everything, rich people probably determine everything, they probably determine every other moral framework that exists in status quo, which means that it's quite like questionable and quite like unconstitutional. But secondarily, why why is ends not determined by powerful people? Because I think that's another key part of Nikhil's case. I have 3 reasons for this. First of all, like individuals to some extent have an agency to choose their own decisions, right? If you don't buy everything else, like they have things like access to information, they have things like a large array of different people that they interact and engage with, and they have things like all the other things in the first place. Secondarily, like I find it very confusing in their explanation on how powerful people dictate moral frameworks and how individuals view what is worth doing, what is not worth doing. I think a large amount of people who are relatively altruistic have engaged in a large extent about like moral philosophy, which is highly not compensated. You literally get no job, you're unable to get a PhD, you're unable to get funding for a bunch of other situations, which means these people often opt into this not because they want to be the moral and elites and like the most powerful people in the world, because they're simply relatively similar in terms of they want to do like understand how the logic works, they're interested in the concept. Maybe they are morally altruistic and want to find out what is the greater good or whether the ends do justify the means in and of itself. The bottom line of our case, and finally weighing a bit above opening government, is OG's first case is that like if something that enables fundamental principles have a long-run impingement on other fundamental principles, like we ought to do it. But this in and of itself is highly contentious. Like El Salvador, is it justified in imprisoning millions of innocents? I don't really know on that. But there's always a question about what the fundamental rights is and then weighing it and all these other different things. I think Rob is the only one that clarifies and explains what this actually is.
So the case from closing opposition is very simple. It's just this, the idea that the end justified the means is simply not meaningfully universalizable. People aren't able to internalize it, act upon it, and so we ought not use it as a moral system or internalize it within our moral systems. Anna tells you, first of all, that means are a lot clearer for people to, interact with, right? The response we get from opening government is people disagree on the means. And I think this is sometimes fair, but it's a comparative claim here, right? Because even in instances where people disagree on the means, they also definitionally disagree on the ends. So for example, if hypothetically people disagreed on whether or not violence was good or bad, then those people would also disagree on which ends are good or bad, because they would disagree on whether or not these ends ought to have more or less violence, right? And so as a result, in each instance where you disagree upon the means, well, I would posit often, not that often anyways, you also necessarily disagree on the ends. So as a result, it's a lot harder for people to internalize which of these means are which ends are morally good or bad. But the problem, additionally, is that it's difficult for you to identify the morally correct way to end up at these ends. So this is the response to Jay's case, which is that like, okay, maybe I think that communism is the ideal utopia, but it's unclear whether or not you ought to pursue this in a Marxist-Leninist fashion and seizing the state and the vanguard or whatever and withering away, or just being an anarcho-communist, etc. So the ends are just often substantially murkier. But the second thing I want to point out is they're often substantially less predictable. So it's often harder for you to predict whether or not the ends will accrue in a particular way at all in the first place. I will deal with your definition nonsense in a second, don't worry. And so ultimately what this then means is that it's not possible for people to, first of all, know which ends are good or bad anyways, but also it's not possible for them to know how to achieve these particular ends in these instances. And the reason why this is important is because in order for us to believe this statement to be true, we have to believe that it's meaningfully applicable within people's moral systems at all, right? So for example, the reason why we don't say like killing is unjustified in war is because that's not something that people can meaningfully act on in general when you're in times of war. And so similarly, insofar as it's not possible for people to meaningfully act on this, it's not something that we ought to believe is true. The way here is very simple. The first thing I want to point out is if you buy Rob's definitional squibble about what the fucking end actually is, and OO's intuition pump is incorrect because like that act of increasing the amount of evil is an end in and of itself, then we're actually immune to this, because it actually doesn't matter how you define it. The point is people aren't able to act on it meaningfully, and so as a result, it is substantially worse. It's not something that you ought to propose. But the second thing I want to point out is their second case actually presupposes that it is true, right? So they say that the reason why the ends don't justify the means is because if they did justify the means, we'd end up getting worse ends, right? Because people would follow the norms of the people in power, which is obviously just like presuppose that they're true, and it also doesn't mean, it means that if following people in power would lead to better outcomes, it could potentially do it. Also, they're wrong. Like, women in the workforce is good. GDP go up, people have more money. But I don't care if this is a knife. They're just wrong. Cool. But we're able to get around this, right? Because we're just able to explain that this is not meaningfully useful to anyone, and therefore we ought not have it as something within our moral systems. But consider the case where maybe we ought to adjudicate this debate on outcomes for some reason, because like fucking everyone becomes utilitarian in every debate ever for some reason. I would posit we still actually access the opening opposition case better than they do. And the reason is our analysis explains why broadly it's quite difficult for people to predict the ends in a meaningful extent. I also point out that oftentimes, and I pointed out that oftentimes people are lazy in how they adjudicate their moral decisions. And the reason why this is important is oftentimes because people are lazy, they want to take the path of least resistance. So they want to continue to oppress people under justification of, we can like continue to attract resources. I know you guys say this part, but you don't do the analysis to explain why the ends are difficult to predict and value, etc. Right? Anyways, and so they're more likely to be able to do that, which explains why the people in power are likely to continue to do the bad things that openly opposition talk about. But our analysis also applies in a lot more smaller instances, right? Because it's not just people in power who do this. I think a lot of times the people on the ground are actually somewhat resilient to the narrative that people in power put in forth, but they still act selfishly. So they cheat on that test because they think that when they have more money, they'll be able to help society to a larger extent, which is them using the end justify the means in a speculative way. Or they don't tell their partner that they cheated on them because they think that they ought not do it and would increase harm, etc. So I think that's the type of stuff that ends up happening when you engage in this sort of framework, because it's often difficult for you to meaningfully adjudicate the stuff to a large extent. Let's then talk about closing government. The first thing I'll point out is even if you buy their definition, yeah, okay, Rob, go.
Okay, so it's not useful, the fact that Louis Becker directed cask door in 1953 is not useful at all. Does that mean that it is in fact false? This is quite like, in order for your case to work, you have to prove moral realism first, because it's not a utility debate.
No, so I don't think that's necessarily analogous, because there's probably some utility in the fact that he did it in the first place and people were able to watch the movie or whatever. But also, I explain why, particularly within moral systems, it must be the case that in order for something to be meaningfully true, it has to be something that people can act upon in the first place. Anyways, cool. The definition of squibble. First of all, we're resilient to this anyway, so it doesn't particularly matter, right? Because our case is just about like people can't act on it. So even if it is the definition of squibble, they can't like adjudicate the long-term ends versus the short-term ends, etc. The second case they have is about utility maxing. I think there's like a subset of the opening government claim. So I'll deal with opening government's version first. What opening government say, effectively, is that oftentimes your duties come in conflict with each other, and therefore the only way for you to resolve this meaningfully is to engage in using the ends justify the means, right? And to be clear, like all the examples are just stuff about duties conflicting with each other, right? So for example, the state has a duty to keep people safe, but also to make sure people have freedom. The state has a duty, or you have a duty, the people in South Africa have a duty to like fight oppression, but also maybe to not kill people. You have a duty to save your child, but also to not lie, etc. But the problem is it's not clear to me that, first of all, that you necessarily have to engage in using like the long-term consequentialist thinking in the first place, right? So you can't just adjudicate the fact that like I have a duty to one actor that's stronger or more intense or whatever, therefore I ought to prioritize that. I think that's broadly what people are able to do, but you can also like consider like from behind a veil of ignorance, I think people are likely to prefer a specific society anyways, so you can try adjudicate in that way. The closing government version then is just that like duties are infinitely more subjective and they're informed in different ways, therefore we ought to try and maximize utility to a larger extent. Opening, actually, do you have a POI really quickly? No? Okay, cool. The problem with I think the utility maxing case is, Firstly, it is somewhat circular. So like Rob says that intuitions are silly because they like are self-defeating, so you can flip an intuition. But then his analysis for utility maxing is also based on an intuition which that suffering is bad, right? He didn't prove that absent any human intuition, suffering is good. So I think we do need to defer to intuitions in some situations anyways, right? Given that's the case, I think the intuition that we ought to hold is utility is, because the fact that it is incredibly difficult for us to adjudicate these utility, the correct things to maximize utility in the most optimal ways. I think this is not a meaningfully achievable moral system, right? I think on the other hand, the way people interact with duties is a lot more intuitive, right? It is something that they have all the experience that Rob's talked about in terms of being pushed down on them from above, etc., right? This is meant to be, like the argument from Rob is that this is a bad thing, right? That the fact that these intuitions are framed by the power that be, and these duties that are framed by the power to be are problematic. But the problem is the utility maxing stuff is also often framed by the power that be in terms of like what type of utilities we ought to prioritize anyways, whereas the duty stuff is at least substantially more in your immediate proximity and your immediate action that you adjudicate based on the actions themselves. I think that's often easier for you to internalize and act upon than the closing government case. For all these reasons, CEO.
I think opposition really will speak this will fun debate. Please remember this is a silent round. Themselves.